Hi, my name is Ned, aka Synth, and this channel is where I get to share my love and passion for synthesizers. In this tutorial, I'll be showing you how I make 10 bass synth patches, as well as how I make a default or initialized patch to start from scratch. I'll be using Innovation Bass Station 2 because it's simple and yet feature-rich. It also has an easy layout to follow. The settings of the parameters of the patches that I'll be showing you will range from a minimum of 0 to a maximum of 100, hopefully making them adaptable to your synth if you don't have a Bass Station 2. If any of these patches inspire you to make some music, I'd love to hear it. Please share a link in the comments below. And if you like this video, please like and subscribe so I can continue to grow this channel. Now, let's get patching. When I start from scratch, I often make a default or initialized patch. I begin by making sure the overall volume is up. Then I look over the synth section by section. I place the knobs, sliders, buttons, and selectors to my preferred default settings. As this instrument uses subtractive synthesis, from oscillator 1, I'll select the bright waveform like Sawtooth or pulse. Any transposition will be reset to 0. Next, I'll look for any mixing section, any area where I have access to the volume of the oscillators, and I'll bring up the level of oscillator 1. In the filter section, I'll select the low-pass filter with a slope of 24 dB. I'll make sure that the cutoff frequency is at its maximum and resonance is at 0. Any modulation or overdrive will also be set to 0. As for the envelopes, I like to have the most basic of shapes, something like an on-off switch. So attack, decay, and release are at their shortest, and sustain is on full. Next, I'll check that any effects are bypassed, and a glide or portamento are set to off. I'll turn off any arpeggiator or sequencer, and I'll make sure that the mod wheel is set to 0. I'll hit a few notes to make sure that I haven't missed a step. The final stage of this process is for me to save my patch and maybe even make copies. Now I'm ready to start. The first patch I want to show you is very simple. It's exactly like my default patch, except that instead of a sawtooth, oscillator 1 outputs a triangle, a simpler waveform. I'll transpose the oscillator down an octave or two. Playing with the filter, I can go from triangle to sine wave and back. I like to explore various envelope settings for this patch. You may need to compensate for the low volume of this patch. Another simple one oscillator patch that I find very versatile uses a square wave with variable pulse width and a short amplitude envelope. Changing the shape of the waveform while I play some notes gives me options for various timbres. I first set the ADSR envelope to have a quick attack and no sustain. I then play with the decay and release settings until I'm happy with the shape. After choosing the square or pulse waveform, I'll manually play with the pulse width while playing some notes. This way I can vary the color of the sound until I find something that connects with me. For a very classic starting point, nothing for me beats a single sawtooth oscillator going into a resonant low-pass filter with a 24 dB slope. I've made this sound so often, I know it so well, that I often program it when I try out new synths. I'll modulate the filter cutoff with an envelope and add a little drive to give the sound some extra bite, a bit like what's heard in a vintage Minimoog. For extra expressiveness, I'll turn any envelope trigger settings to single. This will keep the envelopes from restarting with every note. Sometimes, when I want a really fat, old-school bass, I'll combine 3 oscillators, each tuned to the same note, but separated by octaves and slightly detuned. I like to play with each oscillator's waveforms, sometimes even using 3 different ones, like here. The mix of the oscillator levels is how I adjust the color for the overall source. The sound is filtered by a 24 dB low-pass filter with a bit of drive and resonance, which is modulated by the mod or filter envelope. I then play with the ADSR settings until I find something that inspires me. I love a good 90s style house organ bass. Although I don't have the famous patch from Korg's M1, I know how to come close to it. To make an organ-like sound, I tuned 3 oscillators to form a simple chord. The sub is a square wave, 1 octave lower. Oscillator 1 is a triangle. Oscillator 2 is also a triangle, but an octave higher and an additional 7 semitones, or a fifth higher than that. I mixed the 3 oscillators. Its bright sound can be shaped by a 24 dB low-pass filter with some modulation from the corresponding envelope. The patch is also characterized by a very on-off amplitude envelope. When I want to play with an arpeggiator, I often start with a patch like this one. I use two Sawtooth oscillators tuned an octave apart and slightly detuned. To make the sound punchy, I use a 12 dB low-pass filter with the cutoff fairly low. I then add a lot of modulation from the mod or filter envelope. The envelope settings are really important. Both amp and filter envelopes should have an immediate attack, a short release, no sustain, and short decay. I find it easy to evolve the patch with just a few subtle changes. I'll turn on the arpeggiator and explore the patch. First time I heard a synth sound was probably in the Cars song, Let's Go. I didn't know what it was at the time. In fact, I didn't even like synths in the 70s. Although it's often used for leads, I find it great on bass as well. After turning sync on, oscillator 1 will reset oscillator 2, adding harmonics to create the familiar effect. For me, I like to turn down oscillator 1 and turn up oscillator 2, as that's the one that will allow me to hear the effect. If I change the pitch of oscillator 2, we should only hear the sync effect. Although you could use an LFO, I like to use a mod envelope or a pitch envelope in order to modulate the pitch of oscillator 2. Now to make it really sound like a bass synth, I'll then add a little bit of sub. The overall character of this bass patch reminds me of a swamp, and so I named it Swampy. It's loosely inspired by the bass sounds heard in 9 Inch Nails' Closer. Two oscillators are heard. Oscillator 1 is a narrowed pulse, about 75%, tuned 1 octave lower. Oscillator 2 is a sawtooth. I use a 24 dB bandpass filter with quite a bit of resonance and a little bit of drive. Since I'll be using modulation on the cutoff frequency, I'm going to roll that back all the way down to maybe 25% of what it should be. And I'll be increasing mod or filter envelope depth, maybe by about a quarter or 25%. The ADSR settings are key to getting an organic sounding shape. I'll add a little glide time. This next patch is inspired by the Reese, Kevin Saunderson's famous bass sound in the 1988 house track, Just Want Another Chance. It combines two identical triangle oscillators tuned slightly apart to create some beating. A third adds bass. I like to explore various settings to listen to the beatings and find one that I find particularly stimulating. There have been many variations on this sound since, including using richer waveforms, distortion and various effects like phase shifting, and gating in drum and bass. I also like to play with glide on this kind of patch. This patch reminds me of some synthwave basses. It's short, thick, and nasty. I use all three oscillators, starting with the sub and adding two different octaves with the other oscillators. Oscillator 1 is a Sawtooth, and oscillator 2 is a square wave, one octave higher. The sub-oscillator is one octave lower, and it's a square wave. In the filter section, I'll adjust the cutoff frequency and bring it much lower. I'll add some modulation from an envelope, mod envelope or filter envelope. I'll add a little resonance and some drive. The amp and filter envelopes are very simple, like my default patch, except there's no sustain and there's more decay and release time. I might add a little glissando and then play with the various settings until I find something that really works for me.